You've heard a lot today about uncertainty. Obviously, in this area, especially in low-dose exposures, we have a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And my background is as a regulator. I ran the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration for more than 7 years under President Obama. I was the regulator in the nuclear weapons industry. And dealing with uncertainty, of course, is the big problem in regulation. Our objective, obviously, is to protect the public, to protect the environment as well, using the best evidence available at the time. And so you have to address uncertainty. And you think about what's real uncertainty, though, and what I like to call manufactured uncertainty. Of course, you can't talk about manufactured uncertainty without talking about the tobacco industry. These are some, just a few of their advertisements. This is from before the era where we recognized that lung cancer was associated with cigarette smoking, which is really the early 1950s, those studies came out. But even before that, the tobacco industry was trying to convince people that smoking was safe. But once it became very clear that tobacco caused lung cancer, the industry faced a problem, and the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton said, you have to commit yourself to more science, to better research in public, but really what you have to do is magnify uncertainty. And they did that. It's very well known. We have millions of pages of documents. This is really one of my favorite. They sent regular newsletters out to scientists on tobacco and health, anything other than lung cancer. This said lung cancer rare in bald men. That's why I like to save that one. But we know exactly what they were doing, and the memos say that. This is from a very famous memo written by a Brown and Williamson executive. Doubt is our product, not tobacco. Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It's the means of establishing controversy. And that's what they did. Obviously, we know that that same approach has been used very widely. This is from a famous memo that Frank Luntz, who's an American consultant, did to the Republican Party some years ago about climate change, and he called this global warming. That's what people were calling it at the time. The scientific debate remains open. Voters believe there's no consensus about global warming in the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views will change. So we have to make the lack of certainty the primary issue in the debate. And of course, that went on for decades. Every school teacher in America got this from actually paid for by ExxonMobil and the fossil fuel industry through one of these not-for-profits that appears to be independent. So we saw that very widely, and we see that we know about in tobacco, we know about in climate change, climate crisis, but it's actually used very, very widely. And sadly, it's sort of the go-to or standard operating procedure for many large corporations when they see a problem. They say, well, let's figure out how to make the problem go away by taking on the science. There's a lot of studies showing that workers exposed to asbestos from brake shoes have increased risk of mesothelioma. Ford spent, in this expose, found $40 million to turn out studies by scientific consultants showing that asbestos in brake shoes doesn't cause mesothelioma. They're not convincing, but they're in certain journals, and they're out there. Another example, this is really one of my favorites, a little hard to read. This is the Weinberg group. This is a group that's actually very present in Europe. Did some work for a company that made a product, a new drug registered under the US Federal Food and Drug Administration. Now, we know drugs have toxic effects. The FDA will remove the registration of a drug only for one of two reasons. If it doesn't work, or if its harms greatly outweigh the benefits, because of course all drugs have some harms, but they have benefits, which is why we use them. So in this case, and this was actually on the web until I wrote about it, so the Weinberg folks were boasting about this. The FDA proposed canceling a new drug. This cancellation requires a hearing. Two manufacturers of the drug under attack hired the Weinberg Group to define strategy for the hearing, identify experts to be used in support of the drug, assist in preparation of written testimony, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This led to an extensive process with a written appeal from the first decision linked to 10 additional years of sales prior to the ultimate cancellation of the drug. So they just delayed what was going to happen, but they had 10 years of market share as a result of this. And they were proud of this. That's the remarkable thing. So I've written about this. I have a new book coming out. There's a pamphlet outside if you want to pick it up. It won't be available till early next year. But what I call this the Enronization of science. If you remember the Enron Corporation, US corporation, really built on a house of cards, pretending to make a lot of money trading energy futures. In fact, they made almost no money, but the executives became very rich. The stock went up for a while until the whole thing collapsed, and shareholders lost all their money, pensioners lost their pensions, etc. So what this is exactly what accounting firms did for Enron to essentially make it look like they were a real company. Product defense scientists do for corporations that manufacture products that are dangerous. These are scientists who are hired to defend products or activities in the regulatory or legal arena. Their value is not to really create science, but it's to influence regulators, as I was, and I saw this as a regulator, or to help in litigation, in lawsuits. Their science is really questionable if, of any value at all. In fact, it's rarely real studies. It's usually what I call strategic literature reviews or very biased risk assessments. And we joke the famous line about risk assessments from the first head of the Environmental Protection Agency, actually appointed by Richard Nixon, that a risk assessment is like a captured spy. If you torture it enough, it'll say anything. And that's really what the specialty of this group. So I looked recently on the Glassdoor website. I don't know if everyone here knows Glassdoor, if you want. People talk about what it's like to work for one of these companies. And here's one, Cardno Kenrisk. One staff person wrote, "This is a law consulting company, not a science consulting company. Don't expect to be a scientist if you work for them." Gradient, a company in Boston, some of the principal scientists have questionable ethics. They've been called out for it. Exponent, which is a company that worked for tobacco, it worked for asbestos, it worked for Ford. Sometimes you'll be working for evildoers and trying to make them seem like they do nothing wrong. So that's the basic model. And it's marketed, and this is from the Weinberg Group on the web again. They did a presentation in Europe. Why, if you're a corporation and are faced with potential regulatory or litigation, why should you hire them? Well, there's scarce science out there, and your product is losing its presumptive innocence. So that's a really important concept, because we often don't think about this. Are chemicals presumed innocent until proven guilty? People, we say, certainly in the United States, that's one of our, we teach that to kids in elementary school. You're presumed innocent until you're found guilty, but that shouldn't be true with chemicals. But here we talked about the 4,000 or so PFAS substances. We have good human data on like 2 of them. Do we presume that the other 4,000 are safe? No, obviously we shouldn't be, but that's the basic model of this, of how we often deal with chemicals. It's not the REACH model, obviously, but the REACH model isn't fully applied, but the idea should be, obviously, if there's no data, there should be no market. In the very production of studies, there's a relationship between sponsorship and outcome. This is the most recent example, though I can give you hundreds of examples, about e-cigarettes and vaping, which has become a crisis in the United States. We have about 35 people who have died recently, and many hundreds now of cases of people who have severe lung disease. This study came out earlier this year, before that crisis, and looked at 94 studies of the potential toxic effects of e-cigarettes. Turns out that if you were associated with tobacco company, the likelihood of finding the product was harmful was much lower than if you were an independent scientist. Now, why should we be surprised by that finding, right? Though we think science is unbiased and somehow the studies come out what they will, but in fact, if the tobacco companies pay you, you'll find a result favorable to them. In the literature, we call it the funding effect, the close correlation between the results desired by a study sponsor and the results reported. I like to think of it as the golden rule. If you have the gold, you make the rules. And I think it affects public health, but it affects science, and it gives people a sort of cynicism about science. It's a very dangerous one. If you think on, it's every issue, there are scientists on this side, scientists on this side, they don't agree, we don't do anything, or some of them are all corrupt, and what are we going to do? People throw their hands up. And we need science, we need people to believe science, and this doesn't help us get there. There's a problem in the production of science, but I think actually there's an even bigger problem, it's a harder one to understand in sort of this question of synthesis of scientific studies. Because we never make decisions from the regulatory point of view from one study. We look at the literature, and we pull together experts, and they say, well, what does this literature say? How do we interpret these studies? And we believe that scientists are honorable. They're not going to be influenced by their financial relationships. They're going to look at the studies, and they're going to come to the right conclusion. But I think we have very good evidence that if you have a conflict of interest, it changes the way you look at data. And you may not be aware of that, but it does that. The best example I could find of this is Vioxx, which is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. Really, it's a great drug. It's not on the market anymore, but if you have inflammation, if you have pain, it's very effective, especially if you can't take aspirin or other drugs that cause GI distress. So we have this great little sort of natural experiment. And over 5 years, we got to play this whole thing out. There were several early studies that led themselves to conflicting interpretation, but eventually, and the scientists who work for Merck, which is a very respected drug company, and independent expert disagreed on the interpretation of the studies. But eventually the truth came out because we did a double-blind placebo trial, which is sort of pretty much the gold standard. So we know the truth. That's the great thing about this. So it's a very short time period. In 1999, the US Food and Drug Administration approved Vioxx based on studies that were done by Merck, clinical trials, not comparing Vioxx to a placebo, because if you do it for a painkiller, you wouldn't obviously want to use a placebo, because we have lots of painkillers that work. They compared to naproxen or Aleve. It's marketed in the United States, but I'm sure it's sold everywhere here. It's a little blue pill, right? That 1999, less than 2 years later, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a reinterpretation of the same data by 3 scientists at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, unassociated with Merck. And they said, we looked at this clinical trial, and we saw that patients who took Vioxx had more than twice the risk of cardiovascular event than the ones who took naproxen. Now, doubling or more than doubling someone's risk of heart attack is a huge, huge issue, right? I mean, this is not a minor effect. They published this. Merck's response? No, you got it wrong. Really what's going on here is that naproxen reduce people's heart attack risk. And of course, if you have a trial, one versus the other, either one exposure is raising your risk or the other is lowering your risk. And these are really well-known US cardiologists at academic institutions, but who are consultants to Merck, said it's not really the Vioxx. The naproxen has an antiplatelet effect. It's preventing heart attacks. Now, I like to think about this. If we had a drug that prevented 60% of heart attacks, it would be in the water supply, right? We'd give everyone that drug. But it doesn't do that, unfortunately. What was going on here is sort of obvious. And we learned that, we figured out really quickly what was the correct answer. Because even before this dispute occurred, Merck launched a randomized control trial to see if Vioxx prevented colon polyps. And we have nothing that prevents colon polyps, and actually Vioxx probably does prevent colon polyps. And so it's compared to a placebo. And the top line here is Vioxx, and this is they had to actually stop the trial early. These are cardiovascular events, and you could see the difference between the placebo. It's about 2.5 times the risk of cardiovascular event by taking Vioxx compared to placebo. They had to halt the trial early. They withdrew Vioxx from the market. By then, 80 million people worldwide had taken Vioxx, 20 million in the United States. And just in the US alone, the FDA scientists who worked on this estimated that Vioxx caused somewhere between 88,000 and 140,000 heart attacks. And we have so many heart attacks that wasn't noticeable, but that's what you have to think about. So here's the question to think about. And I'll pause for a minute so you think about, how is it possible that these well-known cardiologists looked at those data and didn't see the obvious? Because right now, when you look at those data, we have a phrase in epidemiology, a statistical test, we call it the intraocular test of statistical significance. It hits you between the eyes. You look at the data now, you say, it's obvious. So how did those Merck-affiliated scientists fail to see the obvious? I think your vision is clouded by financial relations, even though you don't know it's happening, but it's true. That's what goes on. So who pays the price for this? And obviously the first people who pay the price are people who are sickened by exposures that should have been prevented. The hundreds of millions of people who are dying from tobacco-related diseases. But all of these different exposures that went on far too long because we debated the science rather than address uncertainty immediately and say we need to protect people. And in some cases you're going to be wrong, and the regulator is going to get it wrong. But you can't wait to have all the evidence you absolutely need to protect people before you start that protective system. So that's the first thing. But the other thing I want to talk about this, because I know this is sort of a mixed audience. There are people from the corporate world here. The shareholders actually pay some price for this as well, when corporations are caught manipulating the scientific evidence to avoid regulation. And there are two examples I'll just cover very briefly. This was in the news last week in the United States. Johnson & Johnson had to recall 33,000 bottles of its iconic product, baby powder. This is a product every person in the United States knows. There's been some debate over the years, really since 1976, when the US FDA first attempted to have baby powder labeled as potentially carcinogenic, because talc is mined from mineral ore which contains asbestos in some cases, or asbestos-like particles, and it's often contaminated with asbestos. And the FDA found asbestos in baby powder very recently, and Johnson & Johnson had to recall this shipment. There have been big lawsuits facing Johnson & Johnson, which is a company, a very well-known ethical company. When I dealt with them from a worker safety, they were among the best I had any interaction with. There are a number of studies that found ovarian cancer associated with talcum powder use. The epidemiologists are mixed on this. Case control studies are positive, cohort studies are negative. But there's some real concern here. There's one lawsuit in Missouri where 22 women with ovarian cancer sued Johnson & Johnson, alleging their ovarian cancer was caused by Johnson's baby powder. The jurors agreed, and they awarded the women $550 million. That's $25 million each. Now, just as a disclosure, I testified in this case not as an expert witness, but actually as a fact witness, and I was not paid for it. And my testimony actually was on video, never used, but I do have some association with this case. It was interesting to watch. But as a result of this, I was given quite a few really sort of remarkable documents. So and the documents, separate from the causality issues, are really what was fascinating to me. So the jurors were given documents showing how talc firms and their trade associations were able to convince the government not to label baby powder and other products as carcinogenic. One in particular was of great interest to me, one set of documents, because in 2000, the United States National Toxicology Program Board of Scientific Counselors considered categorizing asbestiform talc as a human carcinogen and non-asbestiform talc as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. Now, I sit on the Board of Scientific Counselors of the National Toxicology Program now, and when I was in the Obama administration, I was the chair of the Executive Council of the National Toxicology Program. So I know how the system works. I was sort of fascinated to watch, to see what people on the board didn't see in 2000. But Johnson & Johnson and other talc producers hired a number of product defense firms to oppose this categorization. Their true objective, and this is all from their memos, was to create a reasonable doubt in the minds of the members of the Board of Scientific Counselors. And the strategy, and this is literally from the memos, come up with more confusion. And they did. And so NTP never labeled baby powder or talc as a carcinogen. So obviously, we had literally millions of people exposed to baby powder with no warning. The jurors looked at this, and in addition to those $550 million, they awarded those women $4.14 billion. That's billion with a B, $4,000 million. One of the jurors told the press, "We're just trying to find something that they, Johnson & Johnson, would feel." It was a message award. With that, Johnson & Johnson's market share decreased about 50 billion, and they're now facing about 14,000 suits. Another example in the news all the time, glyphosate, the world's #1 herbicide as Roundup. The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer categorized glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. Monsanto launched a huge campaign against IARC. They hired numerous scientists and scientific consulting firms to defend glyphosate, often hiding that. Their financial role and ghostwriting of scientific articles were not acknowledged. I mean, they went after reporters. They did all sorts of things that really were sort of unseemly. And this all came out in lawsuits, are coming out right now. And when the jurors saw these documents, when several workers who were exposed to glyphosate who developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma sued Monsanto, in every case, the huge awards were driven by not the causality, but the documents and Monsanto's behavior. The first case, jurors awarded a worker $289 million, including $250 million in punitive damage. But shortly after that, in another case, jurors awarded $1 billion each in punitive damage. Now, those awards won't stay that big. They'll be cut back by the judge. But what's going on here is people are looking at these documents saying, how did Monsanto act that way? And they're now facing 20,000 lawsuits. The stockholders, well, as many people know, Bayer purchased Monsanto, even though they knew all these were coming down. They purchased it for $63 billion. So this was from a couple of weeks ago. The Wall Street Journal said this is one of the worst acquisitions ever made by a corporation. Right now, Bayer's market cap is about what it paid for Monsanto. So think about the value that has been wiped out by jurors seeing Monsanto's behavior. So to protect the public, and I actually think protecting stockholders, we need to essentially insist on certain things in terms of science. The first is, I think producers of potentially hazardous chemicals should pay for the research about the hazardous nature of those materials, but they shouldn't control it. It has to be done independently. Research on the safety of products has to be directed, conducted, and interpreted by independent scientists without conflict of interest. And I think it's very important to recognize uncertainty. We're not going to be able to answer, what do we know about every specific chemical within a class? We have to start treating them as a class, not one by one. We had this situation when I was in the government. We called it regulatory whack-a-mole. You regulate one substance and something, you just move to a different one, and we don't have any data about that, so you can just use it, and that's wrong. And we have to remember, and we have to think about this way, the chemicals are not innocent until proven guilty. We have to end the presumption of innocence. So thank you very much, and I think good luck with the very important work that you're doing.